democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Let's turn for a minute to some of the voices from the rally that took place this weekend after the terror in Charlottesville, where Heather Heyer, a 32-year-old paralegal activist deeply committed to social and racial justice, was killed as she was run over, hit by a car that had driven into the protesters, the counter-protesters against the white supremacists. Donald Trump was concerned at that point, talked about violence on all sides. This was the sounds of protest outside his Trump Tower on Fifth Avenue.
Hey, hey, ho, ho. Donald Trump has got to go.
My name is David Bodemer. I felt it was important to come out today and to come out every day and to oppose a president that condones white supremacy. He did not. He took him 3 days to denounce David Duke last year during his campaign. It's very interesting that he made a big point in his campaign about naming radical Islamic terrorism, and also he made this huge show of denouncing MS-13, but he can't come out and denounce white supremacy. I mean, that's outrageous.
Victoria Richter, and I'm here because I'm very concerned about this administration. What's going on is terrible, and what happened in Charlottesville, I thought that was part of United States history, not its current, but not what's happening now, and it's just disgraceful.
I'm Nicole Shippen. I'm a professor of political science at LaGuardia Community College in Queens. Our students are very vulnerable, and we mostly have students of color. Most of them are immigrants. They're from all over the world, and that's what New York sort of stands for. Trump's rhetoric and ideological claims really brought a lot of people out of the woodwork, people who used to be ashamed or could be shamed, and now they can come out and they're proud. And he was able to bring out a lot of those biases, a lot of those resentments.
My name is John Bega. I am with Rise and Resist. The terror that I felt when I saw the burning torches, the pictures, and I couldn't actually believe that that was something that was happening this day and age. And then I was thinking about it, that a person was killed yesterday protesting Nazis in the United States. That completely blew my mind. Just that concept that what we fought for in World War II, we fought against the Nazis. Our grandfathers, our fathers, our grandmothers worked on World War II to stop this, and now we have to deal with that in 2017, that somebody is dying because of white supremacy and Nazism. That literally blows my mind, and it's a hard thing to kind of shake.
We'll be back and we'll be stronger. We'll be back and we'll be stronger. We'll be back and we'll be stronger.
So those were the voices of dissent on Sunday after the Charlottesville terror. Last night, as President Trump came home, first time since his inauguration late last night, there were still 1,000 people outside his residence. Now, that's the grassroots response. And then there's the corporate response, Juan.
Yes, well, on Monday morning, the CEO of pharmaceutical giant Merck, Kenneth Frazier, who's African-American, resigned from the council, saying, quote, America's leaders must honor our fundamental values by clearly rejecting expressions of hatred, bigotry, and group supremacy, which run counter to the American ideal that all people are created equal, unquote. Well, it took President Trump 2 days to condemn the violence of the white supremacists in Charlottesville. It took him only an hour to attack Frazier for resigning, tweeting, quote, now that Ken Frazier of Merck Pharma has resigned from President's Manufacturing Council, he will have more time to lower rip-off drug prices, unquote. The CEO of Intel and the CEO of Under Armour also resigned on Monday from the council in protest, even after Trump made his statement Monday. Ta-Nehisi, Coach, your sense of how these corporate executives now also bucking and saying we're not going to be part of this anymore?
I mean, I guess it's good to see, but, you know, again, I just go back to this. He is who we thought he was. This is not new for Donald Trump. Steve Bannon did not suddenly, you know, materialize in the White House. Donald Trump has a record, and so you know, maybe it's just me, but I'm sort of amazed that people are sort of just, you know, throwing up their hands and saying, I'm shocked. that President Donald Trump, the foremost proponent of the racist birther myth, did not give an appropriate response to white supremacist violence in Charlottesville.
Can you talk about what you just referred to before, your response, what you think Trump should do? You said resign. Can you play this out? What would that look like if President Trump were to resign? And
well, it's hard for me, it's hard for me to advise about what he should do. But I think if he, obviously if he resigned, Mike Pence would become president. You might not still see these kind of overt, displays and open displays of white supremacy. It would not shock me if the investigation into the voter rolls that you talked about earlier continued. Certainly, at the state level, this sort of gerrymandering that's been going on now for, some time to, engineer these states so that, black folks, the power of votes is diluted would certainly continue. I would expect that Jeff Sessions and his efforts to roll back the reforms on criminal justice would continue. I would expect no action, for instance, on the sprawling income inequality. I would expect the continued assault on Planned Parenthood to continue. And so, obviously I'm not trying to defend Donald Trump here, but I think people really need to get that he did not come out of nowhere. It's nice to see that people at this late hour, are denouncing Trump. I mean, folks denounced Trump, when he was caught on tape bragging about sexual assault. And a few months later, some of those same people were still standing with him. So I don't put much faith in it because it's not an individual in and of itself. It's an entire system. It's a political apparatus, working all in concert. And so I think if you were, willing to stand, with a president, who bragged on tape, again, about sexually assaulting someone, I don't know why the line is now. I understand that somebody got killed, but I'm not sure why the line is here.
I want to get back to a quote from your book that when you've talked about the importance of those 8 years when President Obama was in the White House, that you believe he was one of the greatest presidents in American history, that he was, quoting you, he was phenomenal, the most agile interpreter and navigator of the color line I had ever seen. He had an ability to emote a deep and sincere connection to the hearts of black people while never doubting the hearts of white people. This was the core of his 2004 keynote, and it marked his historic race speech during the 2008 campaign at Philadelphia's Constitution Center and blinded him to the appeal of Trump. So his belief in the heart of white people, you feel, also blinded him to the dangers of a Trump. Could you expound on that?
Sure. There are certain qualities that would be required to become the first African-American president. The office of the presidency is necessarily limited in a particular way. You represent all Americans. You represent all Americans in their, most beautiful ambitions, and you represent all Americans in their moral limitations also. And so when we think about great presidents throughout history, when I think about the presidents who I, hold up, Abraham Lincoln, Ulysses Grant, for instance, I can certainly find, periods of moral limitation, periods where I feel like they didn't do the right thing. Abraham Lincoln was a man who urged African Americans late into the Civil War to leave the country, to, enroll in this scheme of colonization, to depart because white people would never accept them as Americans, and at the same time, he was heroic enough to be, as my friend Jelani Cobb often says, shot in the head in defense of white supremacy. So you're talking about, limits from the get-go. And I think to be the first black person, to be the first African American to inhabit the Oval Office, you have to have a sense of white people that I would say most African Americans do not have. You would have to have a degree of trust, a degree of belief. In fact, I would go so far as to say that we were past things like Charlottesville that we just saw this weekend. That was the only way I think somebody was going to be president. The catch is that at the same time that you extend that belief, it blinds you to what actually can happen and what actually can come out of it, like the election of a Donald Trump.
Ta-Nehisi, as we begin to wrap up, I wanted to go to one of the stories that got so much attention that you wrote, and that was the case for reparations. Interestingly, we had Wes Bellamy on before these mass protests and the white supremacist rally this weekend. He's the vice mayor of Charlottesville, the only African-American city councilman, one of 5. And he's the one who was originally pushing for the statue of Robert E. Lee to come down. He couldn't get that approved. And instead, though, he got something like an $8 million reparations fund to deal with equity in Charlottesville. And it was after that was passed that then they just moved ahead. Is that right, Juan? I mean, you were just with Wes Bellamy in Austin at a conference of progressive cities where they said, OK, we're going to take that down, too.
Right. He was able to get the one final vote, a 3-2 vote on the council to then agree to also take down the statue. But before that, the white council members tried to placate him by agreeing to an equity fund for the black community in Charlottesville. It occurred to me this might be a potential at the local level, at the municipal and state level, for politicians to begin demanding equity funds as a form of reparations, to beginning it from the ground up instead of from the national government down.
And that's where all this began in Charlottesville. And if you can comment on that issue, an issue that you were not originally for reparations, and what it could look like today, as even today, after the terror attack, Wes Bellamy is on the air talking about how important it is, once all the media leaves, to talk about equity and the critical institutions of Charlottesville that have remained for so long in the past separate and unequal.
Well, see, this is why I come on Democracy Now!, right? Because I just got informed, because I actually was unaware of all of that. But I think the story points to, honestly, to 2 things. And the first thing is that if there were to be reparations in this country, I actually think it would happen like that. I think it would be a series of small local cases based on very, very specific claims. We think of reparations as this grand sort of action. The Supreme Court passing judgment, for instance, that black folks are owed X number of billion or trillion dollars. Congress perhaps passing a bill signed by a president, and then, there being this national reparations fund. It's not so much that I'm against that, but I suspect what will actually happen, or what would actually happen in terms of a practical thing, is you would see folks look into specific instances. Virginia, for instance, I believe, had a reparations fund for African Americans who were denied access to public schools in the wake of the response to Brown versus the board. The sterilization cases in North Carolina where black women were sterilized, and there were reparations claims made on their behalf. The torture of African Americans in Chicago by John Burge, a gentleman who worked for the Chicago Police Department. A successful reparations claim was made there. I think you would more see it in that sort of way. And so, I'm happy, to, see that happening in Charlottesville, but I'm also happy that the gentleman there didn't stop there. I think oftentimes people think, well, if we win this, that means the end of all struggle and we can go home and, just relax and have a beer. I'm happy to see that he continued.
Do these grassroots movements give you hope right now across the country?
Yes, they're all we have. They're all we have. They're all we have. I smile when I see them. I'm happy to see them. They're all we have right now.
And in the White House, you have Stephen Bannon. There's questions whether he'll remain, but of course there have been those questions for many months right now. You have Sebastian Gorka. You have Stephen Miller. These are well-known people who represent this white nationalist strain, this thread, where you have Stephen Miller, one of the advisors to President Trump, actually holding the White House news briefing last week and saying perhaps the poem by Emma Lazarus, "Give me your tired, your poor," should be removed from the Statue of Liberty, that it shouldn't have gone up there to begin with. It wasn't a part of it originally.
Right. I mean, these folks represent the worst in us. They represent the worst in America. And again, I cannot emphasize that the path was laid by mainstream, acceptable politicians who heard, this birther business, who saw all this, who heard, people, consistently lobbing racist attacks at the president and did nothing and just stood aside. And so, the idea that the party would then be taken over by a much more extreme, a much more vocal sort of white supremacy is not shocking. If you did nothing, if you didn't speak up, during the Obama era, when these, claims of racism, when these charges of racism were being lobbed, if you just stood aside, you're part of the problem. You're part of how we got here. And you don't get off by, after somebody's been killed in Charlottesville, making a statement, about white supremacy at this late hour, after the fruit is already
We have to leave it
harvest.
there. Ta-Nehisi Coates, thanks so much for being with us. That does it for our show. His forthcoming book, We Were 8 Years in Power. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.